Welcome everyone, far and near, to the annual Taha al-Alwani Lectures and Muslim Christian Dialogue. We are delighted at the Washington Theological Consortium here in Washington, D.C. to have each of you with us tonight for a stellar program with two outstanding scholars and speakers who are committed to the well-being not only of religious communities, but of our public good. And this is a time when we are all in thought and prayer for the public good of our people and our nation and, of course, the world. I want to let you know briefly the outline of the evening. I will introduce the speakers tonight one at a time, and each will give a presentation. And after that, we invite you to share questions. Actually, you can do this during the presentations. Share questions via the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. There should be a box that says chat in your Zoom screen. And you may share questions for either or both speakers. And we will come to those at the Q&A time. Again, thank you all for joining us. I want to a special welcome to Ambassador Tony Quainton, who is the board of the Board of Trustees. He's the chair of the Board of Trustees of the Washington Theological Consortium. Thank you, Tony, for joining us. And I will
be here.
Yes, I will move now to sharing introductions. Yvonne, do you have any other instructions for us tonight? Yvonne McKinney is our host.
Yes, and thank you for just allowing me to speak to you without showing my face for a few moments. First of all, to help make sure that we are all able to hear the speaker and fully participate, we ask that you all mute yourselves so that we will not be disturbed by the environmental noise around us. We would do that as a courtesy to everyone. And again, as Larry said, please make sure that you put your questions in the chat box. If you are experiencing any difficulty hearing, we would suggest that you turn up your volume because we have done a little bit of a sound check and we think that we're at a good level for everyone. We are most appreciative of your coming, and if you have any questions, even for me, from technical questions, put those in the chat box as well. And enjoy your evening.
Very good. Well, this is a program about peace builders among the faiths. Just as a reminder, when you share a question via the chat box, just send it to everyone. That way we can field it here as the hosts and the speakers can see it as well. Well, tonight I would like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Sathy Clark. He's the professor of theology, culture, and mission at Wesley Theological Seminary. He is a presbyter of the Church of South India, and Dr. Clark has long been a champion of both Christian ecumenism and interfaith dialogue with a strong global perspective. He bridges the world between the establishment and the marginalized, the global and the local, the academy and the worshiping congregation. For several years, he was on the faculty at United Theological College of Bangalore, India. He was also a visiting professor at Harvard Divinity School. And for the last 20 years, he has taught and lectured on global Christianity, contextual theology, post-colonial mission, and interreligious dialogue in India, the United States, United Kingdom, Germany, Sri Lanka, Korea, South Africa, and Liberia. He is truly a man of the globe and a man of the people. And in his research and writing, Dr. Clark has cultivated specialties in contextual theology, constructive global theology, and theology of religions. He has several current projects in world Christianity, Faces of Jesus in World Religions, Christian Mission, and Interfaith World and Competing Religious Fundamentalisms. We welcome you, Sathy, and I will turn the podium over to you.
Thank you, Larry. It's indeed a great privilege for me to be with you this evening, and particularly to actually be with Sally Sahilgan, whom I've known quite well. He spent a year working with Wesley, and we really became close friends and dialogue partners. So it is a real privilege for me to be with you this evening. What I will do is offer 4 invitations from Gandhi. I've entitled my talk, Gandhi's Invitation to Interfaith Peacemakers in Our World of Competing Religions. So this is probably the most crowded slide. It gets better as we move into the lecture. But it's important for us to keep in mind that Gandhi does not belong only to India. He is a world figure, a man who belongs to us all. And this was something that Horace Alexander actually said. And so what I'm trying to do is use someone from the Hindu background to address us, who mostly, I would say, come from the peoples of the book. And so what I'm trying to do is bring Gandhi's philosophy and offer 4 invitations to each one of us. What are these invitations? And I will go through each of them in detail. The first invitation is to commit to generosity in matters of truth, which are stored in our imperfect religious pots. The second invitation is for us to embrace nonviolence as the indispensable consort of truth. And for Gandhi, truth and God are synonymous. The third invitation is for us to incorporate practice and silence on truth's marches towards peace. So as truth seekers and truth bearers, we incorporate practice and silence as we march towards peace. And fourthly, Gandhi invites us to disentangle the strong bonds between religion, blood, and land. So let's get to these 4 invitations. But before that, let me briefly share with you the context within which we're looking at these 4 invitations. So all of us know that we live in a world of competing religions. And what Gandhi is trying to work with is to change the metaphor of battlefield, where there is a competing for peace, and offer us another image, and that is the harmony of a flower garden. So what Gandhi says is that instead of competing for peace, he thinks of religions as completing each other in peace. So, for example, I've got those 2 sayings in front of you. One is, the world is a battlefield, God is my weapon, the Bible is my ammo. A battlefield metaphor of context of religions competing for peace. But Gandhi actually offers another. For me, he says, the different religions are beautiful flowers from the same garden, or they are branches of the same majestic tree. Therefore, they are equally true, though being received and interpreted through human instruments equally imperfect. So this is basically the invitation to peacemakers. Let's go to the first invitation, an invitation to commit to generosity in matters of truth, which he says, capital T, truth, is stored in imperfect religious parts that all hold together various truths with a small t. So again, what Gandhi thinks about is he's changing the imagination of people to look at how we can understand religions. And do keep in mind that Gandhi is working from Hinduism in a context in which there was both the Mughal invasion that ruled the country for a couple of centuries, and also the British that ruled India for about 150 years, which was thought of as being a Christian expansion. So you can see Gandhi is trying to work within this, and he changes again. He says religions should not be thought of as aggressive organizations. Instead, in Gandhi's imagination, religions are configured as harmonious organisms. And so you can look at this majestic tree that he's working with. And so for Gandhi, he would say, for all of us that take on a commitment to the generosity of truth in religions, Gandhi will say each one within our own religion is called to build the other's faith rather than to undermine it. And keep in mind, Gandhi is working towards building a movement of satyagraha, soul force, that is pitting the soul and the bodies of Indians against the British colonial rule in order to gain their own independence and freedom. Again, Gandhi's call to build each other's faith as we are moving together and realizing that all of us have our own religious earthen pots with truths. But in this, in our interaction with others, we're also asked to try and build other people's faith rather than undermine it. Let me read his quotation. Gandhi says, "So we can only pray if we are Hindus that not a Christian should become a Hindu, or if we are Muslims that not a Hindu or a Christian should become a Muslim. Nor should we ever secretly pray that anyone should be converted. But our innermost prayer should be that a Hindu should be a better Hindu, a Muslim a better Muslim, and a Christian a better Christian. I broaden my Hinduism," says Gandhi, "by loving other religions as my own." But apart from building each other's faith for the sake of sharing our truths in order to lift up the fullness of truth with a capital T, we also are called upon to self-reflectively be critical of our own religions so that we can stretch our own religious beliefs and practices. So Gandhi firmly believed that the Western world had completely forgotten about the Prince of Peace that they brought into different continents in order to expand mission. So for Gandhi, Christian nations had much to learn from the East, including India, about Jesus as the Prince of Peace. Gandhi's frightful outrage at the ongoing wars that were happening in particularly the First World War stemmed from his judgment. And he said that the message of Jesus of Nazareth, the Son of Peace, has been little understood by Europe. So what Gandhi says, if we're generous in matters of truth with each other, we indeed will build each other up, but also look self-critically at each other's religion, but primarily our own. So Gandhi envisions there would actually be new birth, a change of heart brought about in European Christianity by non-Christian Eastern religions. The second invitation. Gandhi calls for us to embrace nonviolence as the indispensable consort of truth. And truth is for him a synonym for God. So Gandhi's logic is imaginative. He, of course, is an amazingly imaginative philosopher. So look at what he does with this notion of God as truth, and then bringing nonviolence as God's consort. So the logic goes somewhat like this. First, truth is made indistinguishable from God, and then all manifestations of God are installed as bearers of nonviolence. And this becomes very important to Gandhi. So Gandhi favors the philosophical formulation, truth is God, rather than the more theological expression, God is truth. Again, keep in mind, where people were involved with what was called, he called, the warring of creeds, what Gandhi says is, for just our movement together towards independence, let's look at truth as God and then allow ourselves to learn from each other so that we can actually exchange matters of truth instead of becoming people that will simply support our own proclamations about God. So what he says is interesting in terms of truth is God. So on the one hand, what he's saying is truth becomes the spacious universal meta symbol under which all human beings may gather comfortably. So what he's doing is using truth to build a large tent where everyone can come in with their own conceptions in order to work under truth. But on the other hand, what Gandhi is also doing is he's trying to work with truth as a public theology. So his feeling is that if you talk about truth as God, you can also have atheists, agnostics, and all of them can become part of a movement towards peace. And this is something that Gandhi does. But the second thing, which is really important for us, is that Gandhi also offers gods and goddesses to be sacrificed on the altar of nonviolence. So let's see how he actually words this, because it's really important, because for Gandhi, God is a two-faced gift to all of humankind. These are his words. Ahimsa, which is nonviolence, is my God, and truth is my God. When I look for ahimsa or nonviolence, truth says, find it through me. When I look for truth, ahimsa or nonviolence says, find it through me. So what he's able to do then is, in his own almost philosophical cunning, he sacrifices all war-making and non-peaceable gods and goddesses on the altar of nonviolence for the sake of truth. Third, Gandhi invites us to incorporate practice and silence on truth's march towards peace. So what he asks us to do is, he feels that there is so much verbosity and wordplay in all that we say about where we want to go, who is right, who is wrong. So he builds practice and silence as bookends for the proclamations of truth. And in doing that, what he's doing also is taking truth and allowing to spill over from the scribes and the priests within their sanctuaries on to the insurgent and protesters on the street. And this is what happens when Gandhi basically takes something from the temple and overflows peace into the street. And this is primarily what he's done. So let me say a word about practice and then about silence. Practicing truth was extremely important to Gandhi. Living out truth, doing truth. And he says this is the only way in which we can start marching towards peace. It's really interesting because Gandhi had many dialogues with various people, including Christians. So in 1931, Gandhi implores Christian missionaries to reflect the aroma of Christianity. So in a colonial context, Gandhi lifted up the peaceful and subtle transformation that Christianity, through its deeds and practice, could accomplish. He says, I have a definite feeling that if you want us to feel the aroma of Christianity, you must copy the rose. The rose irresistibly draws people to itself, and the scent remains with it. And so you'll see that rose, which was a widely accepted symbol of love, becomes important in terms of showing forth what practice is needed. So what he's asking people, instead of all your verbose proclamations, we would like you to start living truth as we march towards peace. This is what happens, for example, when African American leaders visit Gandhi and come back with his message. And Howard Thurman was the one who goes out, experiences Gandhi's ashram, and comes back along with Benjamin Mays to try and work with what this movement means to African Americans in the civil rights movement. And so in a sense, we can say the civil rights movement is an arranging of roses to blunt the thorns of racism in the US. And this movement, in terms of its collective ability to march towards peace, to practice, to act out what indeed is truth, becomes very important to the African American movement. I love these words of Martin Luther King. I will read the larger quotation, even while you have the shorter one in front of you. Martin Luther King says, I came to see that the Christian doctrine of love, operating through Gandhian method of nonviolence, was one of the most potent weapons available to the Negroes in their struggle for freedom. Prior to reading Gandhi, I had about concluded that the ethics of Jesus were only effective in individual relationships. Gandhi was probably the first person in history to lift up the love ethic of Jesus above mere interaction between individuals to a powerful and effective social force on a large scale. So you can see that this practice of lining together, being roses, knowing that there are thorns that actually can take you out, this becomes the nonviolent practice of truth that moves towards peace. But silence was also a purifier of word and action in our march towards peace. You may not know that Gandhi, in his last 20 years, took on an observance of silence. Every Monday of the week, he was silent. Now, it's interesting because he cultivated silence for three reasons. One is his wasn't a silence basically of going into a cave or only into an ashram in a quiet room, but it was a silence that involved productive work as well. In fact, he says, and I read that to you, which is in front of you, the output of work during silence is much greater than when I am not silent. I'm glad my wife is not listening to this, because she will put me to be silent in order for me to work much more than I've been doing around the house. But that's his conception. It's not basically the armchair reflectivity that we're talking about. So you can see the photograph in front of you. So whenever Gandhi was silent, he did have people come to him and talk to him about what was happening in their lives. If he really wanted to say something, he would write a word or two. But Mondays, every Monday, was a day of complete silence. But the silence was not only something that would allow him to practice, but the silence also was allowing him to listen to the inner voice, truth, God. In his words, he says, the divine radio is always singing. If we could make ourselves listen to it, but it is impossible to listen without silence. The third for Gandhi is that silence allowed truth to be channeled into truthfulness. Truthfulness was a very important part of Gandhi. He went on fasts when in fact someone wasn't truthful. He really valued truthfulness. So truth wasn't just an abstraction. It was expressed in words that were truthful. And as you know, when we look around us, particularly through all that's happened over the elections and the kind of grandstanding of politicians, preachers, and even theological voices, you'll see that one of the things that we don't sift out is allowing truth to be sieved or filtered into truthfulness. And so this became a very important part of what Gandhi felt was his notion of moving practice and silence as bookends. He used both of them in order to march towards peace. Finally, Gandhi gives us an invitation to disentangle the strong bonds between religion, blood, and land to achieve peace for all human beings. Now, this is something that is really revolutionary for Gandhi, both in India, but also to many of our religions that in fact are struggling between issues of blood, religion, and land. So all of us know there's a solid relationship between blessed religion, chosen people, and sacred land. And this has led to violence. It has really led to each one of us claiming that our religions are all about peace, and yet we become known for violence. So one religious community battled against another in the claim that God sanctioned the land for God's own elect. You have some of that in Judaism, Christianity, Islam, or the land was sanctified for a religio-cultural people, and that is Hinduism, Buddhism, and we can even say some of US Christianity. So you should keep in mind that Gandhi was struggling against not only a form of external colonization that came from the British that wanted to take over the land, but it also came from inside, where a group called the Hindutva talked about Hindus to come together to eject Muslims and eject Christians and form a Hindu community, which was based on one bloodism, holy land that was gifted to the Hindus, and a common culture that was weaved together by all the myths that bound together Hinduism. So the argument of Hindutva that is still very popular, and one can say already has a major influence on Hindu nationalism, which is the ruling party in India, is this notion that all Hindus are bound together by three of these. But we also see this in the US. The United States has long held that the blessed land was given by divine providence to white Christians to set a nation under God and to establish a reign of what usually is called Judeo-Christian values that in fact will show that we're living under God's rule. So the interweaving of religion, Christianity, blood, the white race, the blessed race, and land, the whole nation under God, forms the basis of white Christian America. And what Gandhi does is he uncouples all of this. He fragments all of this. He's talking about peace for Muslims, Christians, and Hindus. In fact, one of his longest fasts that he takes on in 1947 is because of the killing and murder among the Muslim and the Hindu communities. And he takes on a fast because what he's trying to say is he will give his life that this nation is an interreligious nation of peace for all people. And that becomes extremely important for Gandhi. To end, I love this quotation because I think there's something to it that's really important. And that's the one with Gandhi's photograph, where he says, there is no path to peace. Peace is the path. I like this a lot because in some ways, much of what happens with Christianity that is supposed to be the religion of the way has basically taken Christ, made Christ the way, and sometimes we don't even want to walk in the way, but go through the way to whatever is gifted at the end. Gandhi reminds us that peace is the path. Just as we would say, the way, Christ, is our path, and much of our fulfillment already is this holding together, this joy and the peace and the compassion and love that comes through in terms of walking the way of peace. Let me end with Gandhi's quotation because he introduces the word gospel in it. He says, I'm afraid I must repeat the gospel to you and remind you that when you demand Swaraj, and here I'm interpreting this as freedom or peace for all, you do not want peace yourself alone, but for your neighbor too. Again, Gandhi invites us to generosity in matters of truth, stored in our own imperfect religious parts, invites us to embrace nonviolence as the indispensable consort of truth, which is God. Gandhi invites us to incorporate practice, doing, and silence as bookends on our own march towards peace. Gandhi invites us to disentangle the strong bonds between religion, blood, and land to achieve peace for all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Clark, for bringing Gandhi's 4 challenges to each of us and to our own faiths. We are receiving some questions along the way, and I continue to urge all participants to share those in the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. And we will now turn to our next speaker. And after our presentations, we will have the chat questions addressed by the speakers that the questions are directed to. Our next speaker is Mehmet Sayilgan. He is an assistant teaching professor in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at Georgetown University here in Washington, D.C. He received his master's in religious studies from the University of Alberta and a PhD in religion and culture from the Catholic University of America. His research concentrates on Islamic theology and practice, Quranic studies, Islam in America, and Christian-Muslim relations. Prior to his appointment at Georgetown, Salih served as a visiting professor, assistant professor of Islamic and interreligious studies, and Louisville postdoctoral fellow at Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C. He is the author of An Islamic Jihad of Nonviolence, and currently is working on a book project concerning Islam and its practice in the United States. Welcome, Salih. I turn the podium over to you.
Thank you, Larry, for this generous introduction. Good evening, everyone. So I am really honored to be part of this event, and especially, it's even more special for me to be a part of the lecture that is named after the late great scholar Taha Jabir al-Alwani, who passed away in 2016. He dedicated his life to Islamic jurisprudence, basically, and its interpretation in modern times. So, I mean, in many ways, I would say he had so many things in common with the writings of Nursi, and offered thoughtful approaches to, especially concerning religious diversity. So I'm really grateful. And thank you, Sathy, for your lecture on Gandhi. I'm really delightful to be with you again. So I work with Sathy at Wesley, and he was very generous with me, and also was my mentor. So I'm really delighted. And thank you for the participants for taking your time. I see many familiar faces, so sorry I couldn't say hi to in person, but I'm really grateful to see your faces. Especially, it has been a while. I haven't seen many of you under the pandemic. So just, my plan, so I will try to, go a little bit over, to be done in maybe 20-ish minutes. So what I will do, given that, Nursi is not popular like Gandhi, right? Everyone knows about Gandhi. So so what I will do, given that most of you are not familiar with this Nursi's life, I will briefly go over the context, basically the context of his life, and then some of the principles that he laid out. So hopefully, then we can connect with Sathy's presentation. So Nursi was born in 1877 in the Kurdish region of the Ottoman Empire. He had a traditional Islamic education in the madrasas. So again, the word madrasa today, there's controversy around the education in madrasa, but this is part of Islamic history, especially in the Ottoman Empire, that's basically from great scholars. So not long after completing his madrasa education, he became a well-known scholar in the region. But again, if you think of 19th century, especially late 19th century, this is a dramatic period for Muslim societies, right? So the Muslim world was in a physical and psychological decline in almost all aspects, right? Militarily, culturally, economically, socially, and like many other scholars of the empire, Nursi actually is seeking solutions for the problems of the Muslim societies. And not to mention that in the early 20th century, right, almost the entire Muslim world is controlled by the European powers. Maybe not directly in all cases, but we see colonialism, right? As one historian put it, basically the context of Nursi, the situation of the Muslim societies, from a Muslim point of view, from this vantage point, it began to look like the Crusades were on again. At least, just I want to give you this context to really help us to understand Nursi's writing, right? And then when the Ottoman, given that Nursi lived in the Ottoman Empire's context, the empire struggled with lots of issues. the Christian of Balkans were inflamed with nationalistic feelings and seeking all kinds of means to dismember the empire and to become independent, right? Naturally, they were seeking their independence. So within this context, there are a number of basically responses, how to keep the empire together. So Nursi is among the scholars who's taking Islam, religion, and his departure point, and offering solution for the society. So one of the things in this context, in order to again to keep the empire together, or peace, or the people of different religions and ethnicities together, there is lots of discussion about constitutionalism. So Nursi is again in this context. One of the things he does basically is he sees if he can update or reform the curriculum of the madrasas to see if religion and sciences, they can be taught together. So this is at least an important emphasis from in his writings, that basically one of the reasons is that the Muslim societies is in decline, is because that the religious sciences and positive sciences are so disconnected. So we need to they need to be taught together. So this is basically his writing or emphasizing this this form of education in early 20th century, like 1910. And then he has even a madrasa to Zahra project, because he believed that basically in his time, the education was not really able to address the problems that people were facing, including religious diversity. So he supports the constitutional movement. One of the things that he goes to the Eastern tribes, tribalism is still very very dominant in the eastern part of the empire. He goes to the head of the tribes to convince them that really constitutionalism is good for you, right? Because the sultan will have less power. Of course, what he does, he brings lots of references from the Quran. One of them, and again, is the chapter 42 of 42nd of the Quran, verse 38, in which it said they conduct their affairs by mutual consultation. So he takes this verse as his departure point to argue for constitutionalism. And then one of them, then he received questions. Oppositions in form of questions. One of them is, they ask him, so you are a scholar of Islam, if we accept constitutionalism, then the Greeks and Armenians will have the same rights like Muslims in the new administration, in the new government. And then Nursi actually responds. He advocates that basically that this should not be a threat. Again, remember that this is in 1910s, 1911s. So it is really, his answer is really interesting. So his answer is that non-Muslims' freedom in the context of constitutionalism is that they will not be subject to injustice and oppression. And this is also the teaching of Sharia, Islamic law. Sharia is even concerned about the right of an ant. So this is Nursi's response. If Sharia is concerned about the rights of animals, even an ant, why Sharia would be indifferent to the rights of Armenians and the Greeks? And again, this is the context in which there is so much tension, right, between the religious minorities of the empire and Muslims. But in this context, Nursi actually advocates for them to have an equal right, because he thinks that basically constitutionalism about justice, that everyone will have a fair share. And why, as a Muslim, as someone who follows Sharia, you would have a problem with this? Another question is, again, interesting question. They raised this, tribal leaders, they raised the question. that with the new constitution, then there would be a possibility of having an Armenian governance. So again, today in different contexts, sadly having a religious minority in a high office, whether government or thing, again, this is not a discussion in the US, but I would imagine this is, again, a problem, unfortunately, even in many Muslim majority countries. But this is, again, Nursi addressed this question in 1910 when they asked him why, that there is a possibility that they will have an Armenian governor. Nursi's answer is, if people are fine to have an Armenian mechanic or watchmaker, they should also be fine with having an Armenian governor. So remember that actually there were significant numbers of Armenians in the eastern part, right? Sadly, with World War I, with the conflicts, right, with persecution, that today it is difficult to talk about like Armenians in the eastern part. But in this context, there is actually a significant, I mean, there are an important minority, religious minority in the eastern part of the empire. So Nursi's, again, he argues that, well, if you, given that you work with Armenians, right, you go, when you have a problem with your watch, you go and, an Armenian can fix it, a mechanic, why not to have an Armenian governor? Because in the end, in a constitutional state, people rule, a governor is not the leader of them, but rather in their service. So why you would have a problem? So I shared these two examples because, again, I would say that in this context, it is very unique, because even, unfortunately, even today, in the same context, territories in which Nursi wrote these things, it is difficult to argue for this approaches, right? Not to mention other Muslim majority countries. But unfortunately, and again, from Nursi's point of view, his plans didn't work, because eventually the empire, right, collapsed, right? Now, not long after, the new republic was established. But what is, again, within the new republic of Turkey, then officially it was established in 1923, so it's for those who are not familiar. But with the new republic, there was, again, a little bit room for the for religion, or at least major institutions that were providing spirituality or religious education, they were dismantled. The government, the new republic, they had a religious institution today called Diyanet in Turkey, but these traditional institutions, they were dismantled. Like let's say Sufi lodges. Again, today we barely talk about Sufi institutions, but this basically were the most important religious institutions in the Ottoman Empire, or madrasas, right? So within this new context, Nursi realizes that basically the issue in the modern context is deeper. It's not about politics, it's not about state, it is not about changing the government. There is a deeper issue which is related to faith. So there are, again, apparently he's very much aware of the changes in Europe, Enlightenment, challenge, the process that Christianity went through in Europe. So he's aware of the discussion. So within the new context, and then you have similar positions among the Muslim, Ottoman Muslim scholars too. Could we do the same if we do the same change, or if Islam would go through the same changes in as Christianity in Europe? Can we do better, right? Can we progress? So you have this discussion. So Nursi writes within this discussion, but according to Nursi, the problem was not really, and the issue was not really to go what Christianity went through, but rather that we need some new interpretation that can address the questions of of the Muslim community in the new context. And it is not about politics. It's not about changing the government. It is about faith, that there are challenges to the foundations of faith, and then we need to address them. So in the new context, what Nursi does basically focuses on spirituality, because he believes that this is the best way to make change in the society. And then eventually the new government, the new republic actually takes at least regards him as a threat because of that he is a well-known scholar. There are oppositions in the east because of the reforms, right, as part of the new republic, that he is exiled. So he spent more than 30 years of his life in exile. But it was actually during his exile, in prison and in exile actually, that he wrote his magnum opus that's known as the Risale-i-Nur today. So what is that in the new context, one of the interesting thing that he does, he instructs his readers or followers that reading his work called the Risala, basically in a way a commentary of the Quran, in today's context is a spiritual jihad. So basically, now I know that you all are concerned, I mean, telling his followers, readers, that you are very concerned about the reforms. Now the religious institutions are gone. People are concerned about their spirituality, their religion. So if you want to do something, you don't really go and fight, revolt against the government, have conflicts, wage war, jihad on the government. What you can do, basically, do these spiritual readings to form your faith and others' faith. This is the best way that you can. And then he interprets some of the verses from the Quran, that how, and then from the life of the Prophet, that how basically the issue is about faith. And then in order for you to address it, not to really wage war or do physical jihad, but rather spirituality. And then this is actually known in the community, this is known as Musbat Harakat, positive action. In regardless of your situation, your context, it is always important to have positive action, not to cause any conflict, not to have a physical fight, right? So, for example, some of his teachings related to the positive action. In other words, this could be, I mean, if we connect this to the Gandhi, this will be the context in which he writes about non-violence, so positive action. So, for example, one of them is see beautifully, think beautifully. So always have a positive approach. Always see the beautiful side. And again, given that this again, still given that these the events that the killings, unfortunately, on the name of Islam in Paris, right, in France, because of the drawings of the Prophet, this thing is still relevant. Basically, it depends how you see it. And his approach is that basically steps to violence or negative action begin with mind and heart. So because if you have a positive outlook, right, there is always an option for you to see beautifully. Then you will have a positive mind and positive heart, right? Because the violence starts from there. Another important approach that's part of his positive action is contemplating the universe. Is one of the most important of his teachings, the universe as the creation of God. Because and again, especially in Islamic theology, the idea of seeing the creation as a manifestation of God's names is very important. And there's actually one interesting story in his life. So he goes to his home city, Van, in the eastern part, after the destruction of the World War I. And seeing the destruction, seeing the situation brings Nursi to tears. And then he sees a tree, basically, again, making the tree talk in his writing, that the tree says, well, don't miss to see me as well as a manifestation of God. In this scene, actually, again, in the scene of destruction, now he turns to the tree as the manifestation of God, as again, as a positive approach, a positive outlook, or to keep hope. The other thing is, part of his positive action, he actually wrote extensively on the nature of human being. On, for example, he writes, I mean, he has a treatise on aging, illness, death, in a way, just to see that basic, I mean, the idea is that when human beings, they reflect on their nature, you know, on death, on illness, on that they are vulnerable, that it may make them thoughtful from Nursi's point of view. And then even he says, remember I mentioned that he spent 30 years of his life in exile in a prison, and he sees it as actually part of divine plan. So again, the other option could be like, let me just, once I am released, I can ask my followers to go and wage and fight with the government. But no, actually he does self-criticism. He says maybe he's sinful, he did something wrong, and this is part of God's divine plan, that he's facing the suffering and trials, right? So in a way, contemplating the self is, for Nursi, was a form of a means of an inward jihad. So for example, he part of his ways, you know, his ways, he says, we contemplate impotence, like our weakness. So finding power in powerlessness. We contemplate our poverty, meaning being dependent and needs, which is contemplating. Compassion is our way, right? Even for his oppressors, basically. There are, again, cases where he's asked about you know, the judges who convicted him. He prays for them, you know, especially when he sees their children. And then contemplation of the universe, another way of spirituality in Nursi's work. So one thing concerning just especially jihad, given that when it comes to you know, peace, we talk about peace, but it's also important to talk about jihad, although it's not, again, jihad is not reduced to violence or physical fight in Islamic tradition, but sadly it is, again, it is known, especially in English tradition now, as a holy war. And Nursi's, and again, he basically brings lots of examples from the Quran, from the example of the Prophet, that they arguing that the physical jihad, the time of physical jihad is up. Basically, there is no need to have this. Yes, he acknowledged that jihad is part of Islamic history, but he contextualized it that in the context, you know, territory, military, it was part of the politics, but still, it is. But in today's context, there is no way that physical jihad can serve Muslims. The other is the interesting thing in today's context. Remember, the overwhelming majority of the victims of jihad are Muslims themselves. I mean, just in Syria, at some point there were like 30 different Muslim groups fighting each other, and they would all call their cause as a jihad. So this is, again, although we often think of jihad as an external problem, as a threat to non-Muslims. Yes, unfortunately, there are many victims of, even again in today's context, victims of jihad. I mean, people are killed, non-Muslims, in the name of jihad, in the name of Islam. But the overwhelming majority of Muslims are also, I mean, those who are victims of jihad, they are also Muslims, right? So it becomes also an internal issue. And Nursi believes that basically there is no any way to justify internal conflicts in the name of Islam. Because so one of his points was that arguments that if there is a cause in which people will, your cause would come at the expense of innocent people, then it is not really the right cause, because this is not compatible with the Islamic idea of justice. And he gave an example of a boat. So he said, again, imagine there is a boat, and on this boat there are nine criminals and one innocent person. And again, according to Islamic understanding of justice, one cannot actually sink this boat because of this innocent person. And now when you look at this, again, this approach, it's really difficult to, to make an argument for the killing of non-Muslims, innocent people, based on the teachings of Islam. There is no room. Another principle that he again put forward concerning peace and non-violence is his emphasis on the sacred nature of human beings, that every individual is a manifestation of God's name, right? Again, this is an important theology and important teaching in Islam. So basically, you don't have any right or justification to kill any human being, because this person is part of God's creation, and it is sacred, right? Because that God manifests himself through this person, right? And just finally, some guidelines for modern believers, and then we'll just show a few pictures, and then I should conclude. So one of the things is that one of the principles, service to faith should be free. He even declined gifts. So again, this is in the context where, again, especially given that sadly religion is very politicized in Muslim countries, right? It doesn't mean that you don't have, it's not politicized in other countries, but just given that we are speaking about Islam, but he believes that it should be free, because otherwise there is the risk of politicizing tradition. The other important principle: avoid politics in the name of religion. This is actually it's like, or became a mantra of his followers, because he believes that religion is dividing. When it is connected with a particular party, then basically your opponents, although if they are from same religion, then they became basically, you cannot teach them. And that's why his mantra or his statement, I seek refuge in God from politics and Satan, right? This is so these are again important principles. And then the one other thing is that he emphasized community in the modern time. Basically, one of the practical aspect of his teaching is basically people, they come together, his followers, the readers, and do this commentary that he wrote. And then they believe that it is a part of their jihad. So if you want to do jihad, if you want to make change, if you want to make some spiritual progress, do this reading. So I want to show some of the pictures from this gathering. And let me see if I can share my screen. All right. I think you should be able to see my screen now, right? So this is, for example, one, a girls' camp. Basically, these are all the books that you see in their hands. So it is, Turkish context, it is very common. Basically, hundreds of, women, men, they get together and they just read Nursi's work. It is part of their retreat or spiritual gathering. I did my dissertation actually on these gatherings. For example, on a Saturday in a place like in Istanbul, there are over 500 different gatherings. You see people that in the houses, and they just, again, it's just simple. They come together, they read a Nursi's commentary, mainly about faith, about the nature of human being, about God. And then they believe actually this is their jihad. They believe that this is how they can deal with the challenges to faith. This is another gathering, for example, again, hundreds of young folks. And again, these are not exceptional gatherings. Again, every week in hundreds of different places. Another gathering, again, they come together. Again, you may ask, is there a politician there? Is it like, basically someone comes, they read the Nursi's work together. Another example, women, they get together. And this last example is from the US. Basically, I know there is a woman group, they get together, and then and Nursi's work is their departure point. So they read and they discuss Nursi's work together, and then they believe that this is their spiritual jihad. This is their spiritual work to make change, first yourself, and also if you want to offer something to the society, that this is how it can work. So there is actually, it is very clear, there is no room for violence, for hatred. Actually, Nursi, one of the, again, a statement that is a mantra among his followers, that if you want to hate something, hate the hatred in your heart. If you are really into hate, then hate something that's in your heart. So thank you very much. Thank you for your attention. So I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Salih, and thank you, Sathy. We have a number of questions before us, and I just want to go to some that are related to one another, and then there are some more specific ones as well. So given that we have only about 20 minutes, we ask that you be as succinct as you can so we can get to as many questions as possible. One of the questions is about the nature of truth. Actually, there are a couple of them about that. And one of the questions from Jennifer is appreciating the phrase from competing for peace to completing peace in relation to Hinduism, and this is related first to Dr. Clark. In relation to Hinduism as a baseline, does this mean that there is no fixed, rigid manifestation of the God figure? And if that is true, does it mean that people must be open to see all let's see, I've written this down and I can't read my own writing. See that as nothing is fixed in their own faith, and they must be spacious enough to stop judging others and accept difference as part of the pursuit of truth. So, Salih, was that clear enough for you to, Sathy, was that clear enough for you to
Yes, I think so. So this really, Jennifer's question dovetails with another question. Maynard actually Moore also asked a very similar question. Now, this is really the difference between Islam, Judaism, and Christianity on one hand, and Hinduism on the other. And so we can say that Gandhi relativized the absolutism of scriptures. So he really relativized any sense of revelation from outside. Keep in mind that he was doing this also because of the expansion of Islam and Christianity that came in with this notion of the absolutism of their scriptures as revelation from outside. And instead what he does, he basically works with experiments with truth. So the experience from within, so the inner voice, the still voice, the God voice, that's really something that he's building with. And for him, he feels that in this movement where people basically have an experience of who God is or what truth is, that this creates a canvas for dialogue in the public sphere that will galvanize them towards freedom and peace. So I would say that in many ways, again, this is probably true in most of our religions. You have this tension between those who, in fact, want to start with what we can almost say grazing on the ground from within, or gazing up at heaven from without, you know. And I think this tension is there. Keep in mind that for Gandhi, this was very easy within the Hindu philosophical worldview, because every self is nothing but a manifestation of God. So the relationship between our soul, capital small s, and God with big S, the kind of ontology is really the same. So it was much easier for Gandhi to think about multiple foundations that can be built from below, rather than foundation that came from revelation from above through scripture that tended to divide and bring unpeace to India.
Very good. In relation to Maynard's question about commonly accepted principles, the question pushes further around truth. Where can we find truth, especially in these times and in this environment, which is saturated with lies?
So again, we can go back to Gandhi, right? And this is a huge problem for many of us who are Christians that are sitting in this country and listening to all those things that are said in the name of Christianity, right? So there's lots of ways in which what we thought of as foundational to truth, which is scripture or a preacher basically using the moving voice of God, all of those basically have become flimsy foundations. They basically are plastic. It doesn't seem like the real thing. So I think Gandhi would go back and work with how experience of truth itself with nonviolence is the only way in which you can break up these hard rock-like objects of truth that are utilized basically in the hardness of heart against other people in order to divide us, in order to splinter us, in order to crack us, or also cause violence. So I think he would go back to this notion, and there's a lot within the Christian tradition that allows for this to be worked with. I think Gandhi's contribution to this is to twin together truth and nonviolence. So you can't call Gandhi a relativist. He's not. Because for him, truth as God is, in a sense, non-relative, it's absolutist. And what is coupled with that is non-violence. So both of those basically are absolutes for Gandhi. They really kiss and hug each other on this march towards peace.
So arguing over the facts is not the way to go. It's it's something much deeper.
I think, again, keep in mind, see, this is again, the problem is the context of Gandhi is very different, right? So it was a world in which he infiltrated every home, every hut. It was a place in which there was fluidity of relationships of people. So what we have unfortunately gone to is that I can basically construct a sense of truth and throw it out without knowing my neighbor into cyberspace, and it's bound to hit about 250 people or maybe 1 million people and wound them, right? So this was a very different ethos. And I think some of Gandhi's thinking it needs a lot of reflection and imagination to transpose this into a world that doesn't have the organicity of relationships of communities where they eat together, they live together, and they basically move into each other's spaces constantly.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. A related question about baselines for truth, and this one is for Dr. Sayilgan. Again, from Jennifer, Nursi's whole depiction of spiritual versus political or violent jihad sounds like it is a principle of do no harm. Do not do anything that has a detriment for the other. Could this be one of the baselines for truth in Nursi's view?
I mean, at least, I mean, I would say, yeah, it is this is one of the most important principles for Nursi's positive action. But basically, yes, you may have, again, whether in our context in the United States or in Muslim countries, you have many, many different movements, right? They all have their goals, whether political, whether spiritual, so I don't know, whether to have power, that you have this movements. Or sadly, in the Muslim world, there are many violent movements, right? Again, movements, individuals, again, just the tragedies that we watch in France, right, in recent weeks. So the idea, the principle is basically, yes, one question is that you may have different causes. You may have, your cause might be land, your cause might be a religion, political power, but again, the principles, your means, right? So you have different means to reach this goal. It should never come at the expense of the life of innocent people. I think that Nursi is very clear, and I think I agree with Jennifer that this is maybe a good way of thinking about what is truth, because in the end, I don't think that God would like people to harm each other based on the truth.
Yes, well, thank you. Related to the whole place of jihad, Sally, Imam Khan asked a question about jihad having two aspects, the external and the internal. And this is not as much of a question, but it does deserve a response. The greatest jihad is the struggle within the heart to overcome our nafs, N-A-F-S. Yes,
Yeah.
Can you respond to that?
Thank you. This is a good way to put it. Thank you, Imam. Yeah, unfortunately, even among Muslims, especially in the history, so somehow this physical jihad became louder, more influential. And I would say is it because that this is how jihad was emphasized as part of Islamic sacred text? I would say it is more about politics in the history of Islam. Whenever there's Muslim states, they would wage wars against, to get more territory, to have more things, more materials. So they would use jihad, and in some cases, sadly, the scholars they would extend their support. They would justify their wage their war as a means of jihad. But again, as the Imam rightly points out, that actually it is part of the prophetic example that he is the one who emphasizes that really the greater jihad is the jihad of dealing with your own ego, with your own desire, negative desires, nature. Again, remember, this is an important teaching of Hinduism too, Buddhism too, right? Basically, the root cause of many evil things when you have destructive desire, which may lead to destruction or violence. I want to give one example in this context that how it plays out. So if you are a little bit familiar with the history of Iraq, so in 1991, Saddam Hussein actually modified the Iraqi flag. So he put actually, the phrase that is often cited by the jihadists, those who want to wage war, Allahu Akbar, God is great. So this is in 1991, actually Saddam Hussein, he added this phrase to the Iraqi flag. So now Saddam Hussein, again, we all know his brutalities, the injustice that he commits. As these Muslims, they know that he was not a good example of being a Muslim, all right? There are so many evils that's associated with Saddam Hussein. So he actually added this phrase, this sacred phrase on the Iraqi flag in order to justify his occupation of Kuwait. So to have actually enough support, to have support of his base to justify his wage, right? His wage against another Muslim country. Again, this is one example. So I think see how politics, they can play with religion and can distort the very meaning of jihad, right? Muslim against Muslim.
Thank you. Back to Sathy, there's a question about how do you view the struggle between Ambedkar for truth with Gandhi? Does that make sense if I said that correctly?
Yes. So for those of you who do not know the name, Baba Sahib Ambedkar took on Gandhi. Gandhi became a figure that gradually represented all of India and thought that he represented the untouchable community or the Dalit communities. And in many ways, he usurped their representation. And now this is for those of you who live in this country and understand how whites can exceptionally think for everybody, whereas the idea is that blacks can only think for blacks or Indians can only think for Indians. The same way in which so it was a time in India in which he came up as the father of the nation and was part of this notion that somehow he bought into this myth that he can represent all communities. Ambedkar, who had his PhD from Columbia, had a degree from London, and was a lawyer himself, came from the Dalit or untouchable community. And he actually felt that Gandhi's vision for India needed to also break up caste as a system. See, Gandhi, in order basically not to dismantle the structure of Hinduism, which was caste, talked about how caste mentality can be changed while the structures of caste can still be held together. It's called the Varna Ashrama Dharma. Ambedkar took him on and said that unless you dismantle systemically caste, you cannot basically think that you can change one's heart in order to accept equality. So in one sense, you can say that Ambedkar basically unveiled some of the prejudices of Gandhi, which he still had, even though he thought that he was pursuing truth.
Thank you. There was a question also about the Dalits in India, and comes from Richard Jones. Evidently, Gandhi and Donald McGrath, it was in relationship to a church growth movement, yep, engaged in a debate over the Christian mission to Dalits and other low-caste Indians. What was the outcome of that? And do you have any thoughts on that?
So this is, again, a very interesting way in which Gandhi had to walk on a tightrope. So Gandhi actually believed that conversion of individuals can be done, but he was against mass conversions. And this is primarily because of what happened with Islam and to some extent with Christianity, where Christianity and Islam came in and large communities, primarily of the Dalits, were converted. And Gandhi basically felt that this will destabilize the movement that was pushing for independence. Now, of course, Gandhi had his own biases. So he basically thought that most of these conversions were simply because they were offered incentives by the colonial powers. But this was not true at all. Dalits were actually leaving Hinduism and its caste system in order to embrace the freedom that Jesus was giving them to be brothers and sisters along with Jesus, brothers and sisters along with Jesus, and therefore children of God. So in many ways, I think Gandhi was wrong. So Gandhi had a very interesting way in which he wanted to close the kind of formal barriers or structures of religion and didn't want mass conversions, but wanted to keep the material resources open so you could draw from each other and all of that. And I think this was primarily because of his own strategy of holding a movement together, so there was not big changes in these blocks of religions.
Thank you. Final question. It's two parts, and we have to move rather quickly. Just a few minutes left, and we do have an announcement or two. Final question is about the entanglement of blood, religion, and land, and how this entanglement can take place. Sally, this entanglement of blood, religion, and land, how does that relate to the current escalation of violence between Armenia and Azerbaijan?
Mm-hmm.
Any thoughts?
All right, thank you. I mean, unfortunately, so I mean, at least in the news, so when you see, at least what I would expect from the religious folks on the both sides, to see that, you know, that in the end, in this war is your, I mean, those who are killed, right, harm, are your fellow human beings on the both sides. And unfortunately, and again, I couldn't follow the news very closely, but at least the rhetoric that, you know, both sides that actually applauded the war, you know, but in the end, this is, but you see, again, if religion is really about justice, I mean, you would expect those who are religious, clergy, Muslim, Christian, to rise up and to say, hey, at this, yes, you politicians, you do this, but stop doing this in the name of religion. That there is nothing about religion. And unfortunately, I mean, the answer is yes, it is sadly connected. And unfortunately, I mean, religion can do better, I would say, when it comes to at least distinguishing itself from politics, separating itself from politics when it comes to, you know, the death of fellow human beings. And I think the test for all of us, to see if we can see, you know, each other, you know, regardless of our gender, race, ethnicity, or religion, as the manifestation of God, if we are really truly believers. And I think this is an important test.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We are delighted to have these two esteemed scholars and colleagues and friends to be with us this evening. I also want to share, as I didn't in my introduction, that Dr. Salih Sayilgan is the coordinator of our Muslim-Christian Dialogue Certificate of Studies here in the Washington Theological Consortium. So please be in touch with him or us in our office if you're interested in further pursuit of studies in this area. We have very fine Islamic scholars and Christian scholars involved in this certificate of study. I also want to lift up two things. First, if I may, I'd like to lift up the book that has just been published, and we will have some information shown on the screen about this. The book is entitled Fine Differences, and it is, and if you can enlarge that image for us, that would be wonderful, Yvonne, if you can. Yeah, excellent. Keep going. And maybe kind of just, let's see, if you can get to the actual link, we can actually, maybe you can put the link in the chat box for us, and we will email this to each of you. But Fine Differences is the title of a book that has just been released by the Institute, International Institute for Islamic Thought, in their publishing house, which is a very high quality house, the Alwani Muslim Christian Lectures, from their beginning years up to just a couple of years ago. This is edited by Dr. Richard Jones, Professor Emeritus of Virginia Theological Seminary and the holder of the previous holder of the Alwani Chair in Muslim Christian Dialogue with the Theological Consortium. So this will be available to you for free online, an online version, and make sure we get the links. And I don't know if you have the link there that you could put in the chat box for us, Yvonne. That would be most excellent. I also want to acknowledge the origin of these lectures and being named for Sheikh Taha al-Alwani, a true pioneer in not only Islamic studies and engaging Islam with the West and modernity, but also a true champion of peace himself. And I would like to invite his daughter, Dr. Zainab Alwani of Howard University School of Divinity, to close us by sharing the last words that Dr. or Sheikh Taha Al-Alwani wrote before his passing. So Zainab, I welcome you to share those words.
Thank you very much. Thank you. He said, I sanctify justice, celebrate freedom, and honor humanity. While demonstrating gentleness with the weak, I remind the strong that there is always someone who is stronger than him. I advise the rich to fulfill the rights of the poor, while I remind the poor that the rich among them have been entrusted with God's wealth to fulfill the rights of the poor. I love goodness and gentleness and reject evil. I invite to piety and reject violence. I cling to the rope of guidance and uphold the truth. I fight lies and deceit and forbid corruption. I seek reconciliation to the extent possible. I yearn for peace and despise war. I love humility and strive for a good life. I stand in awe of death, yet I believe that this is a bridge I must cross, to cross from a fleeting life to one that is eternal. I desire the best ending and seek refuge in God from the contrary. I love heaven and detest hellfire. I seek security and hate instability. I abhor hatred. I'm not profane, destructive, or corrupt. My lineage extends to Adam and Eve, for Adam is my father and Eve is my mother. All of humanity are my sisters and my brothers. I do not disdain, betray, or humiliate a single human being. Rather, I strive to guide human beings, light their path, and walk with them along the path to heaven. I seek to be a roadblock between them and falling into hellfire. I love the universe and belong to it. I love all my neighbors in the universe, including its trees, plants, rocks, animals, mountains, and rivers. God, most majestic, has created me from this earth. To this earth, he will return me to it. And from this earth, he will restore me once again. To this earth I belong, and for its cultivation I call. My desire is to elevate the truth. My goal is to spread peace and security in it. My means is to struggle with my own soul in order for peace to be realized and security to prevail. I invite to God, to whom is my ultimate return. Peace is my objective. Security is my desire. Terrorism is my enemy. Conflict is my adversary. Inner peace is my pursuit. Do you recognize me? Do you know on this earth anyone who parallels this description? I'm Muslim.
Thank you, Dr. Alwani. And thank you, Dr. Clark and Sayilgan, for an inspiring evening. And thank everyone for being with us tonight. I wish you well, and I pray for peace for our people and our nation.